Let's link up with Krista on the FYX. She's a wellness coach with a focus on mental well-being and physical strength.
So I'm Rachel. I am the founder and CEO of Allara. And our mission is really to help women lead healthier lives, especially women with reproductive health challenges. I like to say I was put on this earth to fix women's healthcare. My parents literally met because my dad was the on-call OBGYN when my aunt ended up in the hospital and set them up. So literally am here because of women's healthcare, and kind of have weaved that into the rest of my life. Really trying to build a better healthcare experience for other women. Partially that comes out of my personal experience. I was diagnosed with something called polycystic ovary syndrome about 10 years ago. And really just never felt like I had the medical care that I wanted that made me feel like my healthiest, best self. And just got to a point last year where I felt like the system is really broken and I can actually use everything I've learned, professionally, personally, to build something better. And so I would say it's really been, a passion of mine for years that now I've just kind of channeled into Allara has been to improve healthcare outcomes for women everywhere.
Well, I'm super excited to dive into all of that because, as I'm sure you are very aware of this, having experienced PCOS yourself and now building this company, there's a lot to be said for the nutrition component to dealing with it.
Hmm.
And it's great that there is more conversation and a shift happening in the medical field just from other interviews I've done with there becoming more awareness around how do we move into preventative medicine versus reactionary. And I think certainly Allara is a representation of that. So I'm excited to kind of break that all down with you. But before we do, I'd love to know what your morning routine looks like in terms of your go-to coffee order. Do you drink coffee? If you do, what do you like to sip on?
So I love coffee. I am one of those weirdos who loves iced coffee all year round.
Me
So
too.
normally
I'm with you,
I
girl.
do just cold brew with like a little splash of half and half or almond milk. But honestly, I'm at the point where like any coffee needs to enter my bloodstream in any form within the first hour of waking up.
Get you going for the day. Well,
Right.
I'm totally like that too. Like it could be literally 20 degrees and I will happily order a cold brew or some kind of iced coffee variation. Let's get into it. I want to go back to, first a little bit more about your background in reading up and preparing for our conversation. I did see that you had some exposure to startups from the venture capital side of things before you really moved into the medical focus. And I'd love for you to kind of walk us through that part of your story and share a little bit more of your experience and kind of like what gave you the blueprint to start this company. I do have a lot of people that listen to this show who are entrepreneurial, so I think it's worth covering that piece before we get into some more of the science and the nutrition components.
Yeah, definitely. So I think as I mentioned in my intro, I kind of grew up around healthcare. My dad is a gynecologist. So I was always interested in healthcare, but never really saw a way to do anything with it, given that my interests were in business and, I didn't really want to become a doctor. Science was never really my best subject. And so, I ended up going to business school. While I was at business school, I interned for a venture capital fund who happened to lead the first round of funding in an up and coming digital health startup. And that was kind of my first exposure. This was a few years ago, but this really was kind of the dawn of telehealth. Like telehealth, in a lot of ways, is a very nascent industry, and it was really my first exposure to kind of digital health innovation and how startups and digital health startups could really improve healthcare outcomes in a significant way. And after having that first exposure, I just got so excited and really saw this opportunity to blend all of these interests that I had had growing up in healthcare, especially in women's healthcare, with the interests I'd been building in tech and startups and business. And so ended up joining that company full time after I graduated business school and joined as their head of strategy. And again, just really got excited about the opportunity of digital health to transform outcomes. There is a lot of really great healthcare out there, but the issue is how do you access it? How do you make that kind of gold standard healthcare accessible to people all over the country. And telehealth, in a lot of ways, really enables you to expand that access. And so, as you know, I was going through my own personal healthcare journey, trying to manage my PCOS, trying to figure out better healthcare offerings, and just realized how broken the traditional model was. I realized that kind of everything I had learned around digital healthcare, the opportunity for digital health to, build better tools for providers, build better tools for them to collaborate with each other, to track patients more closely and on a more ongoing basis, that a lot of that could actually fix a lot of the issues I was seeing when it came to treating women with chronic health conditions. And so that really was kind of the impetus for me to start Allara, was to, having had this experience of how impactful digital health can be in terms of having better ways and better treatment models for patients, but then seeing also as a patient how broken the experience was. And so kind of putting the personal and the professional experience together encouraged me to start the business.
Sure. There's always something to be said for the fact that when you're directly affected by whatever the problem is, it makes you bring such a different level of passion, appreciation for it. So, and I'm sure that has become such a huge asset for you in growing the company and as a leader. And, in mentioning that telehealth in a lot of ways is still super new. And I think the past year with the pandemic and how many doctor's appointments were not only missed, but physicians having to really pivot to try to offer something different,
Mm-hmm.
it's only become more obvious that that is a challenge. So I'd love for you to kind of give us a comparison to now today, some of the changes, the positive changes that you're seeing versus what your personal experience was like when you were first diagnosed with PCOS. Like what did the doctor's visits and like kind of like the cadence of them and just some of the challenges of trying to coordinate that in your schedule, what did that look like for you?
Yeah. So I always say I think a lot of the issues we see in traditional healthcare are that it's A, episodic, B, siloed, and C, not always, the safest place for women going through healthcare journeys. So if you think about the traditional healthcare model, you're seeing a doctor maybe once a year, maybe you're going to two doctors once a year each. But you're just going to those kind of one-off annual visits, and also those doctors have no way of collaborating with each other. So you might be going, for example, if you're a PCOS patient, you might go to your dermatologist and ask about acne. You might go to your gynecologist, ask about, your regular cycles. But first of all, if you haven't been diagnosed and you're going to two different doctors about two different sets of symptoms, there might be, nobody to put those puzzle pieces together for you and say, oh,
Sure.
actually, all of these sounds like they have a hormonal root cause. Let's talk about the hormonal impact and let's see what's going on. And that's why, on average, it takes somebody 2 years and multiple doctors to actually get a PCOS diagnosis, because in a lot of ways, the care is so fragmented. And again, because if you're really just, especially as a younger woman, you're moving around, you might be switching doctors every couple of years. It's almost kind of felt like I was starting over every time I went to a new doctor, and I would have to re-explain. They would have something different to say. So it just felt really challenging to felt like, given that I had a chronic condition that wasn't going away, where do I find that doctor that is kind of with me throughout my life? And, we talk about medical care being siloed. I think we also see that a lot when it comes to, the medical side of the house and the holistic nutrition lifestyle side of the house. So the other thing I was finding was that, because I was so frustrated with my medical experience, I was trying to do research and figure out solutions for myself. So I
Okay.
found myself on Reddit forums. I found myself on Instagram. I was trying all of these different avenues to try and find an answer. And I found that in a lot of ways, these two sides of the house weren't talking to each other. So you had
Mhm.
maybe people who promoted nutrition programming who either didn't have access to things like your lab work, who didn't have a collaborative agreement with a physician. And it was very siloed in kind of nutrition world. And then the medical side also similarly didn't have a nutritionist to collaborate with. And so even though, it's this condition where ideally you have the lifestyle and nutrition piece taken care of and the medical piece taken care of, they're all sitting in such different places. And so that really was the vision of what I wanted to build, was a way for you to have access to not only, really great expert doctors who could run the appropriate lab work, get you a diagnosis, manage your condition, put you on the right medications, and follow you closely over time, but also to have those doctors work with nutritionists who can help manage a lot of the lifestyle and nutrition approaches that you need help with. And that those nutritionists could be, could have all of the relevant information that they need as well to treat you. So really thinking about it as kind of a holistic care model and not this very episodic siloed care that we tend to get in traditional healthcare.
Absolutely. I think it's really worth emphasizing what you said about the collaboration piece, because in a more positive note, and us kind of walking through the transition of the changes that are happening, I think there's a big push. I see it in my industry as a nutrition coach. I have more clients who are approaching me, asking me if I can read their lab work. And I love that. I love that they kind of have that thought process to advocate for themselves, to be like, hey, is this something that you do, because maybe I'm missing something here and I've
Mm-hmm.
never thought to ask a coach about this before. So I think it's really exciting, and I have a lot of peers in the space who have a ton of knowledge in that area. There are so many more certifications becoming available now for coaches to be equipped to do that, even if they don't have that formalized medical training. um and I think it's it's a positive step in the right direction. But I feel like I'm totally remiss in not having us back up for a second. And first of all, kind of describe what the heck PCOS is. Because I'm sitting here and I know what it is because I have friends who have been affected by it. And I think, unfortunately, it's pretty widespread at this point. But I think it's worth us noting before we kind of move forward and talk more specifically about the Allara experience. I'd love for you to kind of break all of that down for us. So, what is PCOS? And tell us about some of the symptoms that you've personally experienced with it, and then kind of like walk us through how frequently you kept having to tell a doctor, multiple doctors, all these same things until you finally got to the diagnosis.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really great point. So to break down what PCOS is, so PCOS, or polycystic ovary syndrome, is actually the most common reproductive condition in the world. It affects anywhere between 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 women. Unfortunately, the research is still kind of a little bit in its infancy, which is something I'm also trying to advocate for. But really, it kind of stems down to two hormonal imbalances, one of which is an imbalance of testosterone and estrogen. And then also, the majority of women with PCOS are insulin resistant. And so, what that means for symptoms is a mix of, symptoms that are a result of that excess testosterone. So things like acne, excess facial hair, thinning scalp hair, often very irregular menstrual cycles, because you're not ovulating regularly. That also means that as a result of that lack of regular ovulation, about 80% of women with PCOS will experience some form of infertility and need help to get pregnant. And then, because of the hormone imbalances and the insulin resistance in particular, we see a lot of weight management issues with women with PCOS. Anywhere between 50 to 70% of women with PCOS are overweight or obese. Regardless of your weight, about 75% of women with PCOS are insulin resistant, which also means that they are at very increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So we see about half of women with PCOS get type 2 diabetes by the time they're 40, in addition to a whole host of other metabolic issues like high cholesterol, high blood pressure. And on top of all of this, we also see a lot of extra incidents of anxiety and depression in women with PCOS. So I think at its core, it really is a hormonal condition. But if you actually take a step back and look at all of the ways it can impact your life, it actually can be, a really serious medical issue if it's not treated. I think,
Oh,
you
totally.
know, to your point about medicine and nutrition becoming more preventative, that is what I get really excited about. Is okay. I think it can be a little bit overwhelming and scary maybe to get a diagnosis
Hmm.
where you're told, all right, you'll probably have fertility issues, you'll probably be at risk of diabetes. But you also can look at it on the flip side and say, well, you'll know from an early age what you're at risk for. You'll know like what kind of steps you might want to take in your
Sure.
20s to help set you up for success, to help prevent you from getting diabetes, to help ensure that you'll be in a place to get pregnant. And so for us, it's more about looking at it from a place of, how do we think about proactively helping you throughout your health journey so that we make sure you have great healthcare outcomes, as opposed to letting you wait until you're already experiencing diabetes or you're already experiencing infertility and then, trying to work from there, which is a lot tougher. Um, and so I think to your question about diagnosis, that is why really getting earlier diagnosis is so it would be so impactful. So I've been experiencing, irregular cycles for years, a few other symptoms, but I actually was getting an ultrasound to look into some gastrointestinal issues that I had. And
Okay.
that was when they discovered the cysts on my ovaries and said that I had PCOS. So it wasn't even like I told my doctor, hey, I get my period once a year, and they looked into it. It was only when all these other symptoms had become so bad that it was
Hmm.
diagnosed. And I think this goes back to in a lot of ways, like women really need to, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, self advocate and do some of the research and advocate for themselves and ask doctors to run tests. And, if you come to an experience like ours, you shouldn't have to do that. I don't believe you should have to do that. But, like I said, like really, if you think about it, we have this opportunity to give much more preventative care. And so getting people a diagnosis earlier is incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. And to further that point more, I'm not sure if you're familiar with everything that Levels is doing for metabolic health, but I'm actually
Hmm.
wearing my glucose monitor right now. And speaking of all of the points you made on insulin sensitivity as being a factor with PCOS, I was really fascinated in interviewing one of the co founders, Dr. Casey, her explaining that in terms of this whole like reactionary versus preventative approach to healthcare and the infrequency of doctor's visits and it only being a one time a year or two time a year sort of thing, when it comes to concerns in terms of blood work markers related to glucose and insulin, a lot of times once it's already at a range that is cause for a doctor to be like, hey, something's going on here, it's taken over 10 years to get to that point.
Yeah.
So if we know that, then clearly we should be doing something over the course of that decade prior to help that person either make better decisions or just have the information so that they can manage it, right? It correlates to everything. Like even with my clients down to just in the context of trying to lose weight. Forget about all of the like hormonal issues they may be dealing with, gastrointestinal issues they may be dealing with, energy levels, etc. We can't manage or we can't fix what we don't measure. So if it's not something that we're aware of, how are we expected to make changes with it, right?
Yeah, 100%. I could not agree with you more. I think, that is what becomes so frustrating for me is that if we aren't measuring these things, if we don't give people the information, the context they need, how do they really become healthier? And I think your point about weight loss is actually a great one. So what unfortunately happens with a lot of women with PCOS and why their experience is so frustrating in healthcare is a lot of times they'll go in and they'll say, all right, I've been gaining weight. I'm not sure what's going on. And the doctor will say, well, just lose weight.
It's like, well,
Well,
what am I supposed to do with that? I have so many
exactly.
female clients who tell me that. And that's usually the reason why they wind up bringing me their blood work because they're like, well, my doctor just told me to lose weight, but I don't know what to do with that.
Exactly. And also, in a lot of ways, if you tell somebody who is not insulin resistant, who is just like a normal body type to lose weight, the way that you tell them to lose weight might look different than somebody who is, a
Sure.
patient with a chronic disease who has insulin resistance that we can see in their blood work. For that patient, it might be appropriate to put them on medication to help them lose weight, along with their nutrition and diet programming might look a little bit different than somebody who's not insulin resistant and who doesn't have that. But if we don't give you that diagnosis, if we don't help you have the information, these women are sitting there frustrated, not understanding why they
Mhm.
can't lose weight and then being judged by the medical system. And it's almost like they have a like invisible chain around their legs and then we're saying, well, why can't you run faster? Um, so it really is about, how do we help you understand your body and what's going on with your hormones and use that to actually drive the outcomes that you deserve.
And I also think it's worth noting the fact that so many of the symptoms that you mentioned, Rachel, between acne, any kind of GI problems, digestion issues, depression, anxiety, like those can be correlated with so many different diagnoses that it's like, well, how do we finally narrow it down and get to the root of whatever it is without that woman probably going through a lot of cycles of so many different conversations with so many different people. And I think you then couple that with this whole thing about dieting and the person's like going to try 17 different diets to try to lose weight and continually be frustrated when whatever they're doing through that process of altering their nutrition is probably just adding a little fuel to the fire of a lot of these symptoms that they're
Right.
experiencing. But it's like you can't fault them because they don't know where to go next.
100%. And I actually will say that that was part of my personal journey that led
Okay.
me to starting Allara. So in part of this journey, I'm trying to figure out what was going on, how to treat myself well. Um, I went down all these rabbit holes of there are many people on the internet claiming the way you fix PCOS is by going gluten and dairy free.
Hmm.
And, yes, in some cases it may be beneficial to go gluten and
Sure.
dairy free. Again,
The
that's really
anti-inflammatory
personalized.
properties like is a good generalization for that, I think, is why that comes up.
Right. Yeah. And that could be great on a case by case basis. But I
Mhm.
think as a blanket statement, it's a little dangerous. And so I found
Yeah.
myself, on a very restrictive diet,
Hmm.
self imposed, not eating gluten, not eating dairy, frankly, becoming a little bit obsessive about what I was
Sure.
eating. And I was like miserable. I had no energy. Um, I don't think it was the appropriate diet for me. And that to me was one of those peak moments of frustration that really encouraged me to start something better, because if that's the only answer you're getting is follow this really restrictive diet that doesn't even work and just, by the way, might make your problem worse because then you're ruining your metabolism with a really restrictive diet.
Yeah.
um that's
1,000
like
calories
really
a day
not
is not going to cut it.
ex- exactly, like that's a really dangerous um like option for a lot of people. And again, I just felt like people needed more education and more options, and a way to do things better that was actually scientifically backed.
Yeah. And I think as well, like with a lot of the suggestions out there, in terms of like, oh, this worked for me, this worked for that person. Like we said, all of this is so individualized, and it's really hard to study too, because there isn't that gold standard. And this is also something I learned that was so fascinating from talking to Dr. Casey and trying to understand why the medical field has been the way it has been for so long, is the fact that a lot of the research that needs to be done doesn't necessarily fit the best practices, so to speak, because dictating lifestyle and diet and kind of leaving them a little bit open ended causes a lot of potential holes to be poked in some of that research, and saying like, well, not enough of these variables were controlled. And then takeaways aren't being made because the studies just aren't even being done. They're not being funded, etc. And I think when it comes to women's health, especially, there's also a lot of overwhelming examples of the fact that most of the research is geared towards men. And I would imagine that's come up pretty frequently in the work that you're doing with Allara as well.
Yeah, I would say medical research is actually a really frustrating aspect of women's health. There's been very, very little dollars spent on researching women's health. On top of that, if you look at studies for PCOS, there are very few studies. Very few of them have more than like 100, maybe 1,000 patients in the study. It's just a really nascent field, to the point
Sure.
where there actually isn't even a medication for PCOS. All of the medications that patients are prescribed right now are off label for other conditions.
Okay.
And that really is, again, part of the vision of what we're trying to build is, okay, if we start to have a lot of women on our platform, we can do the research ourselves. We can
Collect all
start to
this data.
understand exactly, like we can start to understand, what does a best in class treatment program look like? What does best in class nutrition look like? What does best in class like medication, and how do we get people to adhere that to that medication? And so for us, it's about, okay, we see this massive problem. We see this lack of research around women's health. All right, we'll start doing the research ourselves. And that is part of the vision of what we'd love to build.
That's so cool. And I think that's a perfect transition to talk more about the Allara experience. So I'd love for you to walk the listener through if they were somebody that was interested in working with the company, what would the experience look like from the very beginning?
Yeah. So, I kind of talked about earlier, a lot of the issues with traditional healthcare are it's very episodic and it's very siloed. And that's why with Allara, we really envisioned it being a collaborative chronic care management model. So with Allara, you're actually paired with a team of providers. You're paired with a medical provider. So that's an OBGYN or a women's health NP who has a special background in treating PCOS patients. You're also paired with a registered dietitian who similarly has significant experience treating PCOS patients, and then a health concierge who helps kind of navigate you through the whole process. And so when you first start your journey with Allara, you will get a 30-minute onboarding visit with your doctor. Compare that to the 5 to 10 minutes you get with your doctor in a traditional setting. So you actually have the time to, go over your medical history in detail, go over questions you have. Something I hear a lot is, well, they just prescribed me birth control, but they didn't tell me why.
I was going to
So
ask you about that, but I wasn't sure if it was a totally separate tangent. So we'll come back to it.
yeah, we can. But they actually will have the time to explain to you, why they're running the tests they are, why they're prescribing the medication they are. They'll then order any lab work that we think might be appropriate. So not only looking into your hormones, but looking into potential other causes like is it your thyroid? Is it your
Mm-hmm.
hormones? What does your cholesterol look like? What does your insulin look like? Are you insulin resistant? They'll get your lab work back and order any medications that they think might be appropriate. So, that might be birth control, might be metformin, might be spironolactone to help with your hair and acne. And then once kind of all of that medical intake is complete, you'll meet with your registered dietitian. Again, you'll have that kind of 30-minute in-depth onboarding visit, and they'll actually have access to all of that lab work, all of that information from the medical team, and set you up with a nutrition program that meets your personal goals. So whether that's, you want to lose weight, you want to have less acne, you're trying to start to think about conceiving,
Mm-hmm.
the nutrition program will be tailored to your goals. And, we feel it's very important that our nutrition program isn't just, all right, eat X amount of calories to lose weight. We really take a behavioral and goals-based therapy approach. So less about, we're going to help you lose 10 pounds, and more about, we're going to implement these healthy eating behaviors. And as a result, that will help you meet your goals. And we really, again, believe in this kind of ongoing collaborative care model. So you'll have regular video visits with both of those providers, as well as 24/7 messaging access to your registered dietitian to make sure that you're meeting those goals.
And how is all of this structured in terms of like paying out of pocket, accepting insurance? What does it look like in terms of cost?
Yeah. So right now, the actual subscription, it's a subscription model where
Okay,
you're paying for all of those services. So,
cool.
the doctor's visits, the dietitian, that's all included in an $100 a month fee that's paid on a subscription basis. For your lab work and your medication, we will send it to a place that takes your insurance. So you can work with your insurance to get all of those covered. Over time, we'd love to start working with employers and insurers to get the actual services covered as well. But to start, we are doing that part out of pocket, and then making sure we can help get your labs and prescriptions covered.
That's great. And I think honestly that'll the move towards working with companies and collaborating that way will happen super quickly. I have several clients that I work with currently who actually use their HSA to pay for their nutrition coaching with me, and other people when I share that are surprised because they either didn't think of it
Yeah.
or they're like, "Oh, I wouldn't have expected that to be covered." So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, we do accept HSA and FSA as
Nice.
well. But yeah, I think really the vision is, as we talked about, this really is such a strong preventative care model. Like,
Mhm.
it should be that your employer or your insurer is paying for the whole model, because your care outcomes are going to be so much better. I think that's still something that we need to educate a little bit more on.
Right.
But that's kind of the vision.
And then going back to your journey personally, what were, and again, we're talking just kind of the disclaimer, I think it's worth emphasizing. It's a very individualized thing and it's specific to what symptoms you were experiencing the most, but what changed for you? What changes did you make personally that really finally helped you get relief? Whether that was even just like relief from the conversation with that doctor who happened to find the cysts.
Yeah, I'd say there's really 2 points. I think one, it was when I first got the diagnosis, just to have something to point to that's like, okay, my
Yeah.
body's not just fundamentally broken. I'm not just, getting one period a year because there's something broken in me. It's, I actually have something to point to. That was incredibly helpful. And then once I had that, I knew, okay, at least now I have a guiding, like a guiding point. At least I have a direction to go in, as opposed to feeling totally aimless. Um, I would say the other thing for me has really actually been thinking about my nutrition, and my nutrition specifically when it comes to my needs regarding PCOS. So again, I told you I've tried kind of like every restrictive
Yeah.
diet under the sun. But really what ended up helping me was in the past few years adopting much more of a kind of intuitive mindful eating approach, and really thinking about, how do I stabilize my blood sugar throughout the day? So instead of saying like, I'm not going to eat any carbs whatsoever, how do I think about, what, actually I want to keep my blood sugar stable. So for my meals, I'm going to mix like carbs with protein and fat, and think about what keeps my blood sugar stable, what keeps me feeling satiated, and focus more on it that way and less about how can I eat the fewest calories and carbs possible, which just, it wasn't working for me. And then a lot of that actually came from speaking to a nutritionist and having her really walk me through like why that was so important for my
Hmm.
body to think about my blood sugar, keep it stable, and also think about things like, how much fiber are you getting? Less about how
Yeah.
much gluten, but how much fiber are you getting? And is that keeping you satiated and full?
Right. And I also think even just in you describing going this whole like gluten-free, dairy-free route, I have work with various people who, for whether that's a reason of having celiac or something like that, or working with a client who's dealing with a gut health challenge, even just encouraging them to eat that way for 6 to 8 weeks, it's like the hardest 6 to 8 weeks ever. And in talking to them, like I feel the pain for them because I'm like, I wouldn't really do that if, even if you told me like I have no choice, it would be really difficult. And there's a lot of stress that then comes with that, like social anxiety around being like, well, now I can't go to this restaurant because there's not going to be things here for me to eat, or having
Yep.
to be so deliberate and like making sure you're eating every couple of hours and really like having a list of, yes, these are the foods I can have. No, these are the foods that I can't. And that takes a toll on you mentally, that is also negatively contributing to a lot of these other symptoms that can be associated with this too.
Right. I mean, 100%. A lot of times, like anxiety and stress actually
Mm-hmm.
makes all of the issues you're experiencing worse. So, if you have inflammation, if your hormones are out of whack, anxiety and stress just make that worse. And I think we forget that that can be kind of self-placed anxiety and stress that we're putting on our body when it comes to like these crazy restrictive diets.
And moving away a little bit from the PCOS piece, I believe I did read in another interview you did that you do have plans to eventually focus on some other types of chronic health issues. I don't know if it's still specific to women's wellness only, but I'd love to know a little bit more about some of these other things that Allara plans to tackle.
Yeah, I love that you asked that question. I think I oftentimes get, I spend a lot of time on the PCOS piece just because that
Sure.
alone is so much to
It's
explain.
huge. Yeah.
But really, when I think about my vision for Allara, it is to be the women's specialty care platform. And by
Cool.
that I mean there are millions of women struggling with chronic conditions that really, sadly, have nowhere good to go right now. So, we have 1 in 10 women with PCOS, but we have 1 in 10 women who have endometriosis,
Hmm.
which can be incredibly debilitating. And right now, there is not really great treatment for. There are thyroid disease disproportionately affects women. There are uterine fibroids. There are just a number of conditions that affect women, that affect them throughout their lives. And that right now, the standard of care is just really substandard. So, really, the vision for Allara is to really kind of build out what we're calling our chronic collaborative care model, and apply that not just to our first condition, which is PCOS, but start to apply that to all these other conditions that affect women throughout their lives, and again, improve healthcare outcomes across the board for women.
That's amazing. I think that's a great initiative. And I'd love to know more about the people within the company that make that up. So tell me more about some of the other practitioners that are a part of your staff, and like what they experienced in their field that kind of led them to be like, I want to be a part of this mission.
Yeah. So we have a number of practitioners, a part of Allara. So we have a full-time dietitian who leads all of our nutrition programming. She has PCOS herself and did her master's thesis on PCOS nutrition. She is a literal walking encyclopedia of nutrition knowledge. Like, you'll ask her, okay, what do you think about dairy and PCOS? She'll say like, well, this one study, said this other
That's
study
so
said
cool.
that. Generally, the studies conclude. So, again, all of our programming, we try to keep it incredibly scientifically focused, evidence based. On the medical side, I think, that to me was what was really exciting to see. I think in, maybe nutrition world, things have been a little bit advancing more on the technology side, but
Hmm.
healthcare has always moved a little bit slowly.
Yeah.
And so I did wonder when I launched, would doctors want to be a part of this? And what I was so excited about was to see how excited all of the doctors were about what we were offering. I think, a lot of women can get frustrated and feel like they're not getting good medical care from their doctors. What they can forget or not realize is that it's not necessarily that the doctor doesn't want to provide them good medical care or isn't capable of providing good medical care, but it's that, they have 10 minutes with the patient. Their schedule's running behind. They're like really rushed, and it's just not the right venue for them to provide care to patients
Hmm.
with more complex needs. And so when I told providers, you can have a 30-minute visit with patients. You can do as many follow-up visits as you want. You can run, whatever labs you feel like you need to run in order to treat them well. They actually were so excited about the chance to treat patients the way that they would want to treat them, and not in a way that's dictated by, the traditional model. And so we have a number of providers on the medical side as well, all of whom are really excited about the chance to treat these patients in a way that they actually deserve to be treated.
That's great. And then moving more towards the patients that have experienced Allara so far, what are some women's feedback in terms of testimonials and that sort of thing about their experience compared to what they were facing previously?
Yeah. I think both the saddest and most exciting thing to me about what we're building is how many women said, I literally have not had help before, or this is the first time I felt hopeful, because truly they'd felt like, they'd been diagnosed with this condition 5, 10 years ago, or maybe they didn't get a diagnosis, but they thought they had it. And again, they just literally didn't know where to go. And this was the first time that they actually knew where to go to get help for their condition. And so just literally just the fact of having somebody who understood them, who was there for them, who could support them, like that alone was massive for them. And so far, we just see patients are, number one, just really excited to have a place to go and a place that actually specializes in their care needs. But we've already seen the possibilities of really how much we can keep an eye on patients' healthcare outcomes, and how much we really can prevent worse conditions from happening. We had a patient, this wasn't even her PCOS, but one of our doctors picked up an issues on her lab work with her kidneys and sent her to a nephrologist and was able to catch that earlier. So again, just by kind of keeping closer tabs on women on a more ongoing basis, and not a once a year, maybe we'll run the right labs, maybe we won't, we're able to pick up just a lot more that other people might be missing.
I also think we just have this tendency to walk around assuming that like what we're dealing with is normal, right? And if you don't talk about it with other people, you can't acknowledge that whatever issue you're experiencing with lack of a period, painful period, acne, like we just kind of like couch it and say like, oh, well, it is what it is, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, exactly. And I think especially as women, we do that all the time. We're like, well, it's not that bad, or I'll deal with it at some point. And the truth is, like, it really might be that bad, and it really might be something that you need to address. And so I think, giving people a space where they can connect with each other. That's something else that we have on Allara, by the way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that in terms of like the community aspect.
Yeah, so we actually have a free community. So anybody, whether or not you're a paying Allara member, can join our community on our site and interact with other women who are struggling with PCOS or struggling with women's health concerns. And again, we really just wanted to create that space where you could connect and see that, other people are going through the same things that you're going through. And it might be uncomfortable and it might be painful, but that doesn't mean it's abnormal.
Yeah. And in terms of the community component, right now still being pretty early and the company being in its infancy, how are most women finding you?
Yeah, so we actually have a lot of women finding us on social media.
Awesome.
Again, this was a journey I went through. You're kind of looking for answers and you end up on Instagram and TikTok.
Yeah.
So a lot of them are finding us on our Instagram at Allara Health, or our TikTok at Allara Health. We also try to publish a ton of blog educational content, and really try and give women free educational resources that they can use. All of that is on our website, allarahealth.com. So I'd say a lot of it is through actually the educational content that we're putting out, whether that's on our website or on our social media.
And going into the education piece, in the nutrition world and the fitness world, especially for those of us who have been doing it for a while or have taken the time to get the certifications, educate ourselves, continue that education as new research comes out, just stay abreast to all these different topics. It can be a point of frustration for a lot of us, the fact that there's pretty low barrier to entry into what gets out on the internet. So I'd love your perspective as now the founder of this company, but also as someone who was in that place of being really frustrated and searching for answers. Like, what kind of responsibility do you think we have in both of the roles that we're in trying to audit that information and make sure the correct info is going to people who really need it?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have a huge responsibility to think about the information we're putting out there. I similarly get incredibly frustrated when I see people who have no degrees, no qualifications, are saying things with no scientific backing. But how are you, as just the average consumer, supposed to separate that fact from fiction, right? And that's how I ended up trying all these different random diets. Was half of them were something an influencer told me to do. And so for us, all the information that we're putting out, all of it is reviewed by either our dietitian or by our physicians. We cite evidence, like we will cite actual scientific studies on our content. And I think for us, it's also really important to say, there is no one size like
Hmm.
blanket rule that you can follow, and try to give that context. So, maybe we'll put out a recipe that's gluten and dairy free, but we'll explain like, you don't have to go gluten and dairy free. This is just if that works for you. Or similarly try and share, like if I'm as Rachel sharing on stories what worked for me or what my morning routine is, making it very clear that, that's what works for me and that might not work for everyone. And so for us, we really try to give that context of, look, at the end of the day, it really is in a lot of ways a personalized approach. And you really need to think about what works for you and what works for your body. And I think that's also just a lot of context I'd love to see more on the internet. Like, trust me, I love seeing, what people eat in a day and what their routines
Yeah.
are. I just think it's really important to separate when you're saying it from the perspective of, this is what works for you personally versus trying to say it as a rule for other people.
Totally. I'm always kind of like even wary sometimes of showing people exactly what I eat, or even if I'm talking to clients about looking at their macronutrients, I hesitate to tell them what mine are because I am going through a certain cycle. I have different goals, like those change with time and they're supposed to. And I don't want them to think like, oh, if Chris is doing it this way, then I should do it that way too. And it is so nuanced in that regard. And when it comes to things like TikTok and social media in general, obviously the entertainment factor and like the fun factor, for lack of a better word, is really what's popular. So what can we, obviously this is a podcast, so we don't have the visuals to go along with it, but what can we expect from like the Allara Health TikTok? I'd love to know like what's on there.
Yeah. Well, you might see some videos of me like walking as the intro. We usually don't have content, but we really try to think about our social as a way to just like give you snippets of what you might experience, but also, give you inspiration and tools that you can use in your everyday life. So we have a lot of recipes,
Nice.
on our site, on our TikTok, on our Instagram. We have a lot of tips. We might have like 5 tips to help you sleep better, 5 tips to help manage anxiety. Again, nothing that would ever say like you should take X medication or you should follow X prescribed diet, but really just trying to think about what kind of tips can we give that anybody can benefit from, while also sharing a little bit more about what you might get if you were to do the full program.
Cool. And when it comes to, that example you just shared with like sleep and anxiety, and I know I previously touched on stress and talking about like how that all snowballs one on top of the other. I'd love to know from your own personal experience. We talked a lot about the diet component, but we didn't really talk about fitness. And I don't know what your fitness routine looked like previously, before the diagnosis, or in the process of trying to lose weight. But I think it's worth acknowledging the fact that so many people like go a little crazy on the fitness when they're trying to lose weight. And that can actually, again, also do more harm than good. So I'd love to know how your personal fitness routine has maybe changed in any ways over the years, or what some of the patients that you're working with, how that shows up in the program if they were to join.
Yeah. I'd say personally, I have always been a really big fan of fitness and of working out. I'd say for me, actually, it's just as much mental as it is physical.
Yeah.
Like it really does help my anxiety to work out. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we see, and I definitely fell into this trap as well, is, well, I want to lose weight, so I should just burn as many calories as possible and like do a bunch of cardio. And in reality, that's probably not the best approach. And it might work short term, but does not work long term. And, especially when you are insulin resistant, doing more strength training, building more muscle can be really valuable. So I really have tried to do, less of like the crazy cardio and more of the strength training, not even with weights, but doing like a lot of body weight strength training as well.
Yeah.
I really loved during COVID, but just try to like move my body every day. I generally do some form of like Pilates or strength training, and then I go for a long walk every night to like regroup and clear my brain. And normally I call my mom when I walk.
Love it. And let's use that to talk more just about the business piece and being a founder. What has been the biggest challenge for you in having ventured off completely on your own and starting this company?
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge for me has just been kind of the pressure of it in a way. And I would say for me, the pressure is not just the pressure of, building a business and having employees that rely on me and wanting to make sure that, the lights stay on, but also frankly, just the pressure of knowing that I have a lot of women's health in my hands, and that's a massive responsibility to make sure that, we're treating them all to a standard of care that is
Yeah.
safe, that is high quality. That is a huge responsibility that these women are trusting us with their healthcare, and I take that very, very seriously. So for me, I didn't quite. I value it so much, and it provides me so much mission and purpose, but it also can, be very overwhelming to have that pressure. And then for me, it's also thinking about, it can be a little bit lonely. I think this is something people don't talk about a lot. As a founder, it can be a little lonely. And so trying to find other founder friends who I can talk to, who I can tell, like, this is what I'm going through, this is what I'm stressed about, has been
They can relate.
incredibly
Yeah.
beneficial. Yeah.
And what do your parents think, especially with your dad being an OB, like, and probably coming up through just generationally more of that like old school type of approach to medicine. So do you talk about this with him, and what's his take on all of it? I mean, I'm sure you're
Yeah.
teaching him so much, just as much as he can teach you too.
So, fun fact, my dad is actually a medical advisor to Allara. So,
Nice.
my dad actually helps, develop some of the medical protocols, give medical oversight. I think my parents are ecstatic that I've, quote unquote, gone into the family business finally
Yeah, because you
of
kind of were
healthcare.
taking a different route initially.
Exactly, and going into women's health. And it is interesting because my dad obviously is much more old school, is a little bit older, and I think probably before COVID, this would have seemed a little crazy to him or
Okay.
to some other physicians. But I think because he was forced to adopt telehealth during COVID, and because so many other
Hmm.
physicians were forced to adopt it during COVID, they really were able to see firsthand the power of telemedicine and the
Yeah.
power of telehealth to expand access to care. So he has been, I think, incredibly excited to kind of get to work on the startup and work on what the next phase of women's healthcare could look like.
That's really exciting. And what do you think, in kind of keeping with the theme of like challenges and changes and that sort of thing, what has it been like for you just with going through COVID and trying to grow at this time? Like, do you think it was in a lot of ways advantageous because there was more of an adoption of, okay, our hands being forced here, like either people are not going to get the care or we have to move to this? And just from generally speaking, like the founder perspective of just starting a company around this time, how have you felt about all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, obviously from a telehealth, digital health perspective, I think COVID really showed the power of digital health and the necessity of digital health. So to be a digital health startup, I think we definitely saw telehealth like accelerate in terms of
Hmm.
development over the past couple of years. Um, from the founder perspective, I would say it's both been a blessing and a curse. So in some ways, it made it a lot easier to quit my job and start this because I figured, I'm sitting at home by myself anyways. I might as
Now's the
well work
time
on
as any,
something.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. Like now feels like the best time to do it. I will say, at the early stage, just is so important as a team to, be collaborative, to be able to bounce ideas off of each other. And so I think working from home was a little bit tough for a while in terms of, as a team, like performing at our best at such an early stage.
Yeah.
We started to go into the office a bit more. And I think that has been incredibly beneficial as a team to be able to have that space together. And so, I think COVID for me has like made me even more appreciate the value of working with my team and bouncing ideas off of each other and having that space together. Like working from home is great, but it has its limits at
Yeah,
times.
sometimes you just need that environment to really get the creative juices flowing, especially with changing environment, not it being the same place where you eat and sleep is also where you
Yes.
work.
Yes. I honestly like get so excited on the days I go in to put on clothes that are not workout clothes
Yeah, right?
and go somewhere else.
Yeah, it totally helps with your mental health too. I think
Yeah.
that's so valuable. I also want to know, I'm totally assuming here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but
Mhm.
I imagine that having come from your experience as an intern, being in venture capital, having gotten your start in business, that's a way that you are growing your company in terms of looking for outside investment. So what do you kind of feel has been potentially an advantage for you having sat on the other side of the table, now going and pitching to these same people?
Yeah. I will say something that we don't talk about enough when it comes to entrepreneurs and founders is, at the end of the day, like, your network really could be incredibly beneficial when you are starting a company. And so I feel very lucky that I kind of had a bit of a network going into this. So for example, my lead investor, that fund is a fund that I had met 2 years prior when I was actually looking for venture capital jobs, and we just stayed in touch for 2 years. And they ended up, investing in the company in my first round. So, I think especially during COVID, when it was hard to meet new people, leveraging your network was
so true.
really important. So I think the advice I'd give to other founders, actually, or aspiring founders, is to start making connections in the venture world or in the startup world. And I don't think they need to be, like, hey, one day I want to raise money, but maybe it's, I'm really interested in healthcare. You've made a lot of healthcare investments. Can I like meet you and pick your brain? Because I think having that network and building it over time can be really, really valuable down the road. If you are thinking about starting something, like, you never know who they're able to introduce you to or what other avenues that might open. But if you're just kind of starting from scratch and you haven't taken the time to build that out, it can be a lot harder to get started.
And what has been the toughest part in pitching and beyond making the connections? Like, we established that you got that, but just talk to me about like that component of it.
Yeah. I mean, let's keep in mind that I'm typically pitching to all men.
Right. That was what I was hoping you would talk about. They can't relate as much.
I will actually say I was really pleasantly surprised at how open male founders have been to, the vision of what I'm pitching and, understanding like how important women's healthcare is. But I will say there's a lot of explaining I have to do. There's explaining, what is PCOS? Does it affect so many women? What's our vision of not just treating this one condition, but treating all complex women's healthcare conditions? And so there's just a lot more I have to explain because they haven't had that experience firsthand. But I think once I'm able to explain, how massive the problem is, right? We're talking millions and millions of women, how costly the problem could be, right? We're talking half of these women are going to develop type 2 diabetes. Then all of a sudden it really starts to click and resonate. And I think they're able to come along on the journey, but there definitely is a little bit more explaining that you have to get to.
It makes me think of, I'm sure like Sarah Blakely's founder story in terms of her even just finding a mill for her first pair of Spanx. Like, no one would take her because all of them were run by men and they didn't understand why these pantyhose were going to be revolutionary in any capacity. And I'm pretty sure that the guy who ultimately manufactured them for her had 2 daughters and he brought them home to them and they were like, this is really cool. You should do this. So.
Yeah, exactly. I've just had to get very comfortable explaining, things like periods to a lot of men, but luckily I'm pretty bold and I don't really mind doing it.
And what's been your favorite part of starting this journey?
I think for me, it really is getting that feedback from patients. Even before we launched, we had a wait list going and I would have people emailing me and saying, please let me know the second you launch. I'm just so excited. Like, I really had never had help before. And so, for me to hear from a patient and hear them say, like, you truly helped me, or to see that, a patient is pre-diabetic and we're getting them on the right medication, or that we caught this woman's kidney issues, like, that to me is just so rewarding. And it reminds me, why I'm building this, why I'm dealing with all the stress and all of the work is because we actually are changing people's lives. And that's incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, it's so impactful and you can't put any kind of price tag on that or hours worked on that. Like, it's such a gratifying feeling for sure.
Right.
Before we move into our lightning round, because I want to be respectful of your time, I do want to ask one other question more in like the business sense of everything. Yep. If you were to look back and just kind of looking at your career choices and taking that internship that ultimately led to your job in telehealth, do you feel like that was the catalyst for what you've done since in building Allara? Or do you think that you might have eventually found yourself in this space just because of your own personal health experiences and like the challenges and friction that you faced?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I probably would have ended up in this boat anyways, but I think, if I think about where I am today, I think really the value has been in being willing to be flexible and, changing my mind when I get new information. So for example, when I was in business school, I only wanted to be a venture capital investor. Those are like
Okay.
the only jobs I looked at. That was all I was willing to explore as an option. And then I think I mentioned, I got introduced to this digital health company, and it was just so excited by what they were doing. Couldn't stop thinking about digital health. I was like, wait a second, maybe, I don't want to be an investor. Maybe I actually want to be a player and, build something in this space. And so, I think that's another thing to really think about, maybe for other people who are interested in entrepreneurial journeys, is to be open. And when you see something you just get really excited about, to be willing to change some of your, preconceived ideas and try something different. And so, I always say, I think you end up where you're supposed to. Like, I think sometimes it's hard to see if you had told me 5 years ago that this is what I'd be doing, I might not have believed you, but I wouldn't really change anything, because I think you do kind of end up where you're meant to be.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment 100%. I love that. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining me today. I absolutely love this conversation. I definitely want to keep tabs on where Allara is going. Like I said, I love the mission. So much of the work that I do with the women that I work with, there's so much need for this, and it's really exciting, and just continuing this momentum of nutrition coaching, moving more into that practitioner mindset. And then of course, all the work that your team is doing, it's a really great step in the right direction, and it's all really positive. So happy to have connected with you, to hear it right from the source. But to wrap everything up, I'd like to finish with a quick little lightning round, much lighter questions, less serious.
Okay.
We'll end it on a fun note. You ready to go?
Yes.
Okay. So I actually didn't ask you, where are you based?
I'm based in New York City.
Nice. Okay. So we'll do some New York City related things, because I'm actually sitting in New Jersey. I'm at the Jersey Shore right now, although it's raining. So,
I'm still jealous you're at the beach.
Yeah. What is your favorite restaurant in the city?
Via Carota.
Nice. It's a good one. What's your favorite, like, going back to your diet and the whole thing you said about like kind of restricting a lot of foods, when you finally moved away and moved into an approach of more intuitive eating, what was the first thing that you started eating again that you were like, oh my gosh, why did I give this up? Or I really missed this?
Okay. So I'd say the thing I have less often is cacio e pepe, which is excellent at Via Carota.
Yeah.
But the thing that actually I gave up, that I cannot believe I gave up, is apples, because I thought they had too many carbs. And now I have an apple with peanut butter every day, and it's one of the highlights of my day.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I even find with a lot of people, when they are looking at their macronutrients, they're super afraid of apples and bananas. And I totally was a person who was like anti-bananas for a while. And I more so justified it as like, well, I'd rather eat other things instead. And then I'll have a banana. I'm like, why did I ever not eat this regularly, right?
Yeah, I didn't have an apple for a year, and then I had one. I was like, what was I thinking? Apples are great.
You mentioned that you like to do Pilates. Do you have like a favorite Pilates studio or workout, maybe during COVID? I don't know if you did a lot of things virtually that you like to follow.
Yeah. So my two favorite workouts are solid core. I do solid core once or twice a week in the city. And then I have a trainer who used to be at this place called Switch, but they shut down, and now he does his own thing. His Instagram is your favorite color, and it's body weight hit workouts, and they're incredible.
Nice. Very cool. Let's see what else. More New York related things. What's like a favorite day trip that you would take to get out of the city? Are you like a Hamptons girl, upstate New York, Jersey? Where would you go?
So if we're talking day trip, I highly recommend going to the Rockaways, like Rockaway Beach. It's pretty easy to get to. It's just like an hour each way, and it's actually a really nice beach day.
Nice. And then what is your favorite thing to do to just unwind, like after a very busy day? Like as a founder, other than mentioning the walk you take when you usually call your mom, what else do you like to do to just decompress?
So I was going to say, like, literally every day after work, I go for a walk, and I normally walk to the West Side Highway. The other thing I like to do, I like to get foot massages. So in New York, they have these very cheap foot massages. So I might go to a foot massage place for like an hour.
It's a good one. And you also mentioned that you love getting out of your workout clothes into work clothes a couple days a week just to feel like a more normal person, I guess. And I feel like that's something we've all missed for a while over the past year plus. Do you have a favorite like brand of workwear?
Oh, so I'm lucky I work in tech and I don't have to wear real work clothes. I wear like jeans. But I think I own everything Zara has ever made
Love
at
Zara.
this point.
Love Zara. All right, last question. And this is the one where I want you to include all of the handles, social media. I know we dropped it throughout the conversation, but we'll include it in the show notes and definitely want you to reiterate it again. But tell us where we can find you, stay connected with you virtually, and then just kind of wrap it up. And I always like to call this like your shameless plug, but what's kind of like the number one takeaway you'd want somebody to have from this conversation?
Yeah. So anybody who'd like to learn more about Allara, you can find us on our website, allarahealth.com, our Instagram or our TikTok, which are both at Allara Health. You can always email hello@allarahealth.com. And, I just would love women who are struggling with hormonal conditions. So if they are looking for a place to go that is that more collaborative care model, that has a doctor who will understand them and has other resources, we'd love to work with you and see if we can be a fit and help you better manage your health. So it really is just a part of your life and doesn't take over your life.
Awesome. I love that last thing you just said. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been such a pleasure connecting with you. To everybody who tuned in today, please share this episode. We dropped a bunch of different stats about PCOS and just women's health in general and how widespread of an effect it has on people. So I'm sure there's somebody in your life that that could get a lot of valuable information from this conversation, even if it's just learning that they have a place to go to feel like their voice can be heard. This has been another awesome episode of The Fix, and we hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.